The Man of 1,000 Voices. The colorful lives of Mel Blanc, Bugs Bunny, Woody Woodpecker, Porky Pig, Tweety Bird, Foghorn, Leghorn, Yosemite Sam, etc. "How are you today, Bugs Bunny?" inquired the neurosurgeon. His tactics seemed like 1,000 to 1 chance, but the discouraged physician had tried nearly everything else. As he surveyed the comatose patient in the full body cast, like the others in the room, he simply wasn't interested in giving up. He had chuckled and guffawed too many times at voice actor Mel Blanc's wacky cast of audio characters to let them simply fade into silence. Unfortunately, that appeared to be their fate. The horrific 1961 car accident, which had landed Mel Blanc in the hospital, seemed to signal their demise. The other driver had sustained minor injuries, but Blanc was driving a little sports car and had broken both legs, his pelvis, and suffered 3 skull fractures. Sadly, he had also been comatose for about 2 weeks. Mel's wife and son had tried everything they could think of to rouse him. The doctors and nurses had also exhausted their methods. Finally, one of the doctors told those in the room he was going to try to reach Mel not directly but through his many voice roles. Like most of the country, the doctor was a big fan of Mel Blanc's characters, especially Bugs Bunny. Working up as much optimism as possible, he asked Bugs how he was doing. Following a discouraging pause, a weak voice emanated from Blanc's previously soundless mouth. It wasn't Mel's voice that responded to the question. Instead, Bugs Bunny himself answered with a faint, "Just fine, Doc. How are you?" Exhilarated by his success, the surgeon asked Tweety Bird if he was also there. His question was soon greeted with Tweety's signature phrase, "I taught a putty tat." As a room full of wide-eyed witnesses took in the miraculous event, it was becoming evident that Mel's lovable cast of characters would emerge from the coma before he did. One of the other doctors in the room later observed, "It seemed as though Bugs Bunny was trying to save his life." As Mel slowly arose from the coma, one character at a time, he was unaware that Bugs, Tweety, Porky Pig, and the rest of his captivating inner personalities were answering their curtain calls while he slept. When he was later informed of what had transpired, he wasn't quite as amazed as his family members and the doctors. "You see," he explained, "I actually live these characters." The precursors of those lovable personas emerged early in Mel's life. In grade school, he was already playing around with different voices to amuse his classmates. Not exactly a social wallflower, he continued to give birth to a variety of creations, and by high school had added a peculiar high-pitched laugh. "I used to laugh down the hall and hear the echo coming back," he recalled. A few years later, that laugh would find its way into Woody Woodpecker's beak. His first jobs were not in voice acting, but the musical field. When Mel was only 6, his family relocated from San Francisco to Portland, Oregon. That's where Mel would later begin his inimitable career. At 15, he started singing on radio station KGW's weekday children's program, Stories by Aunt Nell. 4 years later, he was hired for the station's popular Hoot Owls program. He wrote and performed on the late-night variety show, sometimes playing musical instruments or singing, Before long, his love of creating voices pushed him to include humorous stories, which he narrated in various dialects. In 1932, Mel moved to Los Angeles to find more radio work, but other than a spot on a syndicated show called Merrymakers, radio gigs seemed scarce. Although L.A. didn't provide him with a living, it lined up something even better. A beautiful young lady named Estelle Rosenbaum. The next year, Mel returned to Portland with Estelle as his new bride. There he produced a radio show which he co-hosted with her, titled The Cobwebs and Nuts Show. They wouldn't allow me to hire anybody else, he later told an interviewer, because they were too damn cheap. The lack of actors prompted him to develop a stable of sound characters, each using distinctive voices. The downside was that rapidly switching back and forth among the voices was exhausting. Estelle convinced him to leave the show after a couple of years, predicting that if he didn't, a nervous breakdown was squarely in his future. She suggested they return to Los Angeles, where many of the syndicated radio shows originated. Her intuition was perfect. This time, Lady Luck seemed to be walking by his side as he knocked on the studio doors. Mel began voicing characters for performers like Johnny Murray, Joe Penner, and eventually Jack Benny. Mel's role on Jack Benny's show was originally limited to the voice of a bear named Carmichael, who guarded Benny's vault. Well, I did the bear growl for 6 months, Mel reflected. Finally, I said to him, "You know, Mr. Benny, I can also talk." His not-so-subtle hint worked. Before long, Mel had assembled a memorable group of madcap characters for the show. Among these were a slow-talking train station announcer, a parrot who always called Benny a cheapskate, a stressed-out store salesman, Jack's exasperated violin teacher, Professor LeBlanc, and Cy from Tijuana. Benny would later express his amazement and delight with Blanc's huge character repertoire. "There are only 5 real people in Hollywood," he once quipped. "Everyone else is Mel Blanc." Blanc was enjoying the radio work, but also wanted his characters to materialize somewhere other than in the listener's mind. Warner Brothers' popular cartoon shorts seemed to furnish the ideal setting. He repeatedly tried to audition with the production supervisor for Looney Tunes and Merry Melodies, but never managed to arrange an interview. After a year of constant rebukes, Mel learned that he had passed away, and a man named Leon Schlesinger had taken his place. Fortunately for Mel, Schlesinger agreed to his request for an audition and hired him on the spot. Mel's first major role came about when Schlesinger inquired, "Can you do a pig?" The studio had created a lovable creature named Porky Pig, but weren't satisfied with the voice actor who played him. The problem was, Schlesinger told Mel, the fellow had a noticeable stutter and caused the studio to use up a lot of film working around his speech problem. Ironically, the former pig player actually gave Mel the idea to include a rhythmic stutter into Porky's speech pattern. A year later, in 1938, another favorite, Bugs Bunny, was born. The studio originally wanted to call him the Happy Hare. Mel remembered that Bugs's creator, nicknamed Bugs Hardaway, had a snappy way about him, always saying things like, "Hey, what's cookin'?" Mel suggested they merge the writer's glib attitude with the characters, turning "Hey, what's cooking?" into "What's up, Doc?" The writer's nickname was also a natural for the new creation. Blanc instantly recognized Bugs as a winner. Bugs was a tough little stinker, he reflected. That's why I came up with a Brooklyn accent. As Mel would later vividly demonstrate when his friends emerged during his ongoing coma, he definitely lived his characters. As he brought them to life, he would take on their physical mannerisms. Onlookers could usually figure out which character he was playing when they looked through the glass sound booth. Those characters, incidentally, have returned the favor of the birth of their voices by keeping their creator alive. On television and movie screens across the world, the humanity and wacky sense of humor of Mel Blanc is also forever preserved, at his request, on his headstone. That's all, folks.